Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. The British Parliament has voted to authorize airstrikes in Syria more than 2 years after it voted against such a proposal in 2013. Here are some of the exchanges that took place between Prime Minister David Cameron and Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn.
But I hope that at the end of it all, the House will come together in large numbers for Britain to play its part in defeating these evil extremists and taking the action that is needed now to keep our country safe.
Whether it's a lack of strategy worth the name, the absence of credible ground troops, the missing diplomatic plan for a Syrian settlement, the failure to address the impact of the terrorist threat or the refugee crisis and civilian casualties, it's becoming increasingly clear that the Prime Minister's proposals for military action simply do not stack up.
The news comes a day after U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter said the U.S. will deploy specialized expeditionary targeting force of 200 personnel to fight ISIS in Iraq, exceeding the 50 special operations forces already authorized by President Obama in October. It also comes as German parliament is poised to approve a plan that would send 1,200 troops, planes and ships to Syria, along with other military forces. This would be the first time since World War II that Germany has sent troops to fight anywhere. To discuss all of this from Brussels is Jean Beaumont. Jean is a mathematical and statistical physicist at the University of Louvain, and he is co-author of Fashionable Nonsense and Humanitarian Imperialism. Jean, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Jean, with more U.S. military personnel headed for Iraq and the increased British, French, and now German military in Syria, do you think more military force and increased coordination between the coalition members will defeat ISIS and bring about an end to the civil war in Syria?
I think if they want to defeat ISIS, they should coordinate with the Russians and the Syrian state, for one thing. And they don't, as far as I know. The other thing is, of course, that there should be a coordination between all the state actors. If the state actors can't agree among each other, and that means Turkey, Iran, the Syrian, the Iraqi state, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Western powers, etc., and Russia, then I don't see how that's going to come. And of course, those state actors are not trying to coordinate or to get to an agreement. And then, of course, then you have to see what to do with the non-state actors like the Kurds, ISIS, etc., and the Palestinians. I mean, it's a big mess. I mean, it's too complicated for a simple individual like me to tell you what a solution would be. But certainly, it seems to me that the population of the West should realize that they've put themselves in great danger, at least in continental Europe, because the continental Europeans can't protect their borders anymore. And so that they've created a big danger for themselves by with this policy of intervention. And the policy of intervention was the root cause of our problem. Now, how to solve them, I have no idea. That I'm afraid that's my conclusion. But I don't see why going gangster-like against the international law, intervening in Syria without coordination, without agreement with the Syrian state, with the danger of a collision with the Russians, as we have seen with the Turks destroying a Russian plane. I don't know what's going to happen. I can't be a prophet, but because it's a very dangerous and complicated situation. What I find remarkable is, for example, in Paris, there are all these demonstrations about climate change, but there is no demonstration whatsoever about war and peace, nothing at all. And there is no political movement which actually even reflecting on these things.
Now, negotiations in terms of bringing about a peaceful solution is apparently underway. Is it possible for negotiations to produce beneficial outcomes for the majority of Syrians if the principal decision makers around the table are those ones that are dropping bombs and funneling arms and providing funding to opposition groups in Syria?
Well, the point is that, of course, negotiation must occur between people who are fighting, otherwise it doesn't make any sense, like the Vietnam War ended when there was negotiation between the Vietnamese and the Americans. But here they have to, of course, they have pretended to make negotiation without involving the Syrian government, without asking the Iranians, etc. they have to put everybody, all the actors around the table and try to see how they can find a solution. But of course, ISIS itself will be out of the equation, I suppose, and it's not clear. Then it means you have to really defeat them militarily. And as I say, I have no knowledge of how strong they are, how much popular base they have, let's say, at least in Iraq, so that it will be difficult to defeat them. After all, the United States has been fighting terrorism supposedly in Afghanistan for since 2001. And what has happened there, or 2002, and what has happened there? When did they, where is the victory? I don't see the victory. And terrorism is, or ISIS-like terrorism is spreading in Africa and spreading elsewhere, and they are waging war in Yemen, etc. I mean, I don't see any solution in their policy because they have created an impossible solution for themselves. I've always been critical of this violation of international law, but I never thought that would be that bad from their point of view, that the backlash would be what happened in Paris now. And now they've created a situation. I don't know. I mean, of course, the Palestine-Israeli conflict is going on, and there is no solution to that either. Nobody has any idea about how to put pressure on Israel. Nobody dares do it because of the domestic pressure in the United States and elsewhere. So, I mean, we're in a complete mess. I see, okay, I would like to say, okay, there's a solution, but I don't see any solution.
Jean, let's unpack this a little bit in terms of who actually wants this war and who's fighting or arguing to prevent it?
Well, it depends which war you're talking about. There are several wars. The Turks are fighting the Kurds. They are supporting the Sunnis in Syria. The Saudis are supporting the Sunnis. There is a lot of Sunni-Shiite war, whatever we think of it. And then, of course, the US has been supporting, both the insurrection and now fighting the insurrection, supposedly. The Russians have a consistent policy. I don't know if they will succeed. The Russians at least obey international law. They go with the permission of the Syrian state and they fight along the Syrian state. Now, whether they will win or not, that's, the future will tell. I don't know. They seem to think that the Syrian rebels are just a bunch of relatively isolated rebels and terrorists that can be defeated militarily. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, I don't know. Future will tell. I'm no expert in relationship of force. But of course, we have created this situation. I mean, there was, of course, the illegal invasion of Iraq, but there was much more. There's been the war in Libya, which was also illegal, at least to the extent that it was carried on. All these giving weapons to people in a foreign country is illegal from the point of view of international law. International law was the only solution we found after the war to avoid generalized war, because the Germans had been intervening in other countries before the war, and that's what led to World War II. So the only way to avoid that is to strict respect for international law. But then they came with the responsibility to protect and so on and so forth. And they always thought that, the humanitarian warriors, as I call them, or the alleged human rights defenders, always come and they say, well, we're going to fix the problem by intervening and by bombing and supporting this and that group, etc. And now they created what was entirely predictable and was tried, that people who created international law after the war were trying to avoid, namely a huge mess. A conflict which is a conflict between everybody and everybody, because there are several groups fighting in the Middle East now. The Israelis, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, the Hezbollah, the Kurds, the Sunni and the Shiite, the Iraqi government, the Syrian government, ISIS, and there are several groups in the opposition, and then there's the Russian. I mean, we are heading towards World War III as far as I'm concerned. I mean, that might be a possibility. The only thing, as I said, the only thing that prevents World War III are the atomic weapons. It's ironical because people like Einstein and Russell and so on after the war were worried about the atomic weapons. But now the atomic weapons is actually, something that keeps the peace, because nobody wants to go to atomic war, and everybody realized that it would be mutually assured destruction. They have at least realized that in the 60s. And so nobody wants to go there. Nobody wants to start a full-scale conventional war, because they know that's going to lead to nuclear war after a while, or a short while, actually. Otherwise, there would be, I'm sure there would be a war between Russia and Turkey. There would be a war in Ukraine. There would be a war. There would be conventional war between big powers all over the place if there were no nuclear weapons. So it's very ironical. But the question is, how long will it last?
Right. And everyone puts a lot of emphasis on defeating ISIS as being the crux of bringing about a peaceful solution in the region. But is it possible to even be at the table speaking of bringing about a solution when your policy is interventionist in terms of all of these countries that are now fighting it out in Syria?
Defeating ISIS would be, I mean, that was also defeating the Taliban. Are the Taliban defeated now? I don't know, you see. And what about the equivalent of ISIS or the sort of, similarly minded people, if I may say so, in Libya, in Mali, in other countries, Boko Haram? What are we going to do? Are we going to defeat terror? I mean, they seem to be an endless problem, because there is a constant war between us and the Muslim world, which is seen, at least by some Muslims, as being a total religious war against them, and then they react by religious fanaticism. But that's, as I say, I mean, I certainly don't think that we are going to help by intervening there. The Russians are in a different situation, because they stick to international law, and their relationship to that part of the world is different, in the sense that they have not had this interventionist policy. They don't have this colonial policy in the past, at least not in the Middle East. And so maybe their intervention might do something. I don't know. I know certain Syrians who are happy that they intervene, but whether that will be successful or not, that remains to be seen. And in Iraq, I think it's a totally different ballgame, because the Sunni population is clearly, has rejected the Shiite state, and I don't see how the Shiite state or the Iraqi state is going to regain the entire territory that it has lost.
No matter which way you cut it, Jean, the Russian bombs are falling on civilians, and that is not going to create a very receptive position for Russia in Syria either.
Well, that depends, of course, on which. Yeah, of course, but of course there are other civilians who are support. I mean, those who are in the government-controlled zones. I mean, just because they kill civilians may be unpleasant, but that doesn't mean that they can't win. After all, lots of civilians were killed during World War II, and World War II was won. And the Algerian War. I mean, the Algerians killed French civilians and so on. I mean, we may not like the killing of civilians, but that doesn't mean that the war can't be won. But of course, whether it will, as I say, I mean, I'm unable to know how it's going to turn out, because the Sunni world is quite big, and of course, to the extent that the Sunnis increasingly may see the war as against them, then of course that's going to create a bigger and bigger mess.
All right, Jean, I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.